Hey everyone. Thanks for joining us for the first session of our Learn Live Security 101 series, Basic Security Concepts. My name's Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our speaker for today. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining me. So, yeah, we're gonna spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about some basic security concepts, and as we've already said, this is part of a series, and so I'm hoping that you'll find it valuable. Please ask questions in the chat. This is based on a GitHub repo, which is aka.ms/sec101-beginners. So we'll be talking through, I'm not going to go through all of it because we don't have time, but we're generally go that you can see there. So with that, I think let's get into it. So what I'm going to cover today, I'll just give you a quick introduction to myself because this is the first one. Then we're going to talk about the CIA triad. We'll talk about common cybersecurity threats, risk management, security practices and documentation, what zero trust is, the shared responsibility model, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for a bit more Q&A. Although I will, like I said, I will keep looking at the questions in the chat and try and answer them as we go, or as best I can anyway. So like I said, I am live here. This is not a recording. I'm actually, I'm sat, it's quite late at night because I'm not where I normally live. So do ask questions. You'll keep me awake. So real quick, my name is Sarah Young. I'm a principal security advocate at Microsoft. I've worked in security for over 10 years now. I love talking about how we can secure things. I've written some Microsoft Press books for some of the exams we have. I'm the co-host of the Azure Security Podcast, which is a podcast that's been going shockingly for nearly 5 years now. I'm definitely a crazy dog woman. I don't put a picture of myself up. You can see me on the camera, but these are very cute. I live in Melbourne in Australia, but right now I'm actually in London, so it's very late at night for me. Didn't forward plan how I was doing these sessions. So let's get into it then. That's enough about me. So let's talk about the CIA triad. Oh, excuse me. So the CIA triad is really, really important, and I don't think we talk about this enough. These are the three main principles and the three things that we're concerned about when we talk about cybersecurity. So what we have here is we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They are the three things that we are concerned about protecting or maintaining as a cybersecurity professional when we look at the security of IT systems. So confidentiality is probably the one that most people think is all about typically in security. So confidentiality is keeping data protected, making sure people who don't see things who shouldn't do it. And then we have integrity. So integrity is about protecting the accuracy of data. So making sure that someone doesn't change data. So that might sound not particularly serious, but if, say, you got someone's medical records and someone changes, the amount of medicine or drugs that they've had if someone's in hospital, and then the next doctor comes along or nurse and gives them too much and gives them an overdose, someone could get really sick, someone could die. In a more, maybe less dramatic fashion, if you think of in a business decision, if you're looking at sales figures and trying to project and make really important business decisions, and you're making data that is inaccurate, that has been tampered with, your business could go bust. So that's why integrity is really important. And of course, we are talking about people who aren't authorized to change data. There are times when we do need to change data, but we're talking specifically about this changing of data. And then the last one, again, I don't think people know this is a general issue in IT, but probably don't consider it to be too relevant specifically to security, is availability. So you may well already be familiar with the phrase availability, but that is, of course, making sure systems are actually available to use. They're available to use, and they do what they need to do when you want them to do it, and that people can access them when they need them. But if you think about it, I'm sure most people here are aware of DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service, because we hear about DDoS in the media. Now, a DDoS attack is an availability attack, because if you send a DDoS attack against a website or a business, and then they're not able to communicate with the outside world or trade, that's an attack on availability. Availability means availability. If you're, say, an e-commerce website, if you're Amazon and your website is down, you can't make any money because no one can buy things. So it is part of security as well, though not everybody realizes that. So also, there's another couple of important security concepts that aren't part of the triad, but are worth mentioning just as we're talking about them. And the first one is authenticity. So this is, well, I won't read it to you. You can see it on the screen there, but it's basically making sure that we know that information or whatever is what it says it is. It hasn't been changed. And you might ask how that's different from integrity. In fact, they're quite similar, like they're sort of intertwined. But authenticity is actually giving an assurance it hasn't been changed, whereas integrity, if you had an attack on integrity, that's the actual action of changing things. I know that's like maybe a little bit weird, but they are slightly different. And then we have this one. Now, I can never say this word, so bear with me. Non-repudiation. So non-repudiation is basically when the easiest way, like I said, I won't read it. The easiest way to talk about non-repudiation is, well, that I think most people would be familiar with, is when you serve papers to someone. So, if you're suing legal action, and you need to serve papers on them. So that's kind of like non-repudiation in a way, because when you serve those papers, you are making sure that they are handed to the person, and they are put in their hand, essentially, or and so then if subsequently, say, you need to evict someone and you've given them eviction papers and they say, well, I never received them, I didn't know, the fact that you served them and you put them in their hand means they can't deny that. So that is non-repudiation, and we do care about that in security in an electronic form as well. So yeah, that's my best explanation of that one. And then there's privacy. Now, again, this is one of those ones where people might say, oh, well, how is privacy different to confidentiality? And privacy is sort of a niche bit of confidentiality. So privacy refers to protecting sensitive and personally identifiable information about individuals. So confidentiality is any kind of data at all, but privacy is specifically referring to stuff that relates to individuals. And of course, so that's sort of the difference as well. Privacy is about making sure that people don't access, they don't change, or use any data that they shouldn't be allowed to. And of course, I'm sure everybody here knows about, privacy acts and privacy regulations that exist throughout the world, and there's various ones in jurisdictions. Of course, where I am, well, up here in Europe, where I am at the moment, Europe is well known for having some of the most stringent privacy standards and how we handle people's personal data. So that's just a couple of concepts I wanted to have as like So let's look at some common threats that are out there. Now, I will say that it's really important that to state here that this is changing all the time. Common cybersecurity threats are, there are some things that stick around, but it is a changing landscape. It changes all the time. So before we get there, though, I want to go into the attack specifically. I mean, it's worth asking the question, as this is a 101 course, why do malicious actors want to compromise data and IT systems and do these security breaches? There's some obvious ones, of course, and ones that you'll be more familiar with. Obviously, to make money. We know there are lots of people who are out there to try and make money and scam and trick people out of getting money. Or maybe they're holding a company to ransom with ransomware saying, we'll only unlock your data if you pay. There's also espionage, of course. That is one that we hear about a lot. We often see it in the media, in media like films and movies as well. But it does happen in real life, and often. But often with espionage, because they're often spying and trying to look for a data or a particular target, you find that is much more targeted, whereas the folks looking for financial gain are just trying to find anybody easy to get money off. So we do see a lot more financial gain than anything else, and I don't suppose that will change in the future. So the next, I think, the disruption and sabotage. Some people just like to see things burn. And I've just seen the comment that high-tech vandalism is disruption and sabotage, and I agree. Some people like to break things just for the sake of breaking things and cause. And then sort of a more extreme version of that, or a more serious version of that, is the folks who are ideologically motivated. So, that can be because, people protesting against, they don't like a particular group of people, or it might be something in their ideology says they want to go and attack or breach a particular group of people or a particular business. And that is something we see. The last one, though, and this is probably the one that's overlooked the most, and I guess it's not necessarily a malicious actor, but it's worth calling out here that sometimes security breaches and security issues happen by accident. It is entirely possible that a security breach and an issue is done by some poor person who has just made a silly mistake, because we're all humans. And it does happen possibly more often than you think as well. Apologies for this really ugly slide. I could not get it to do the columns properly. Don't know why. So common types of cybersecurity threats. I'm sure you've definitely heard of at least a few of these. So phishing. Phishing is when an email or a message is crafted telling someone to click on a link or fill in their details, whether it's credit card or something else, and then the person will try and extract money from them. So we're all aware of, maybe a prince who wants to give you $1,000 or $1 million. I think most people are pretty savvy to those, but now we've seen that evolve into something. So spear phishing is when they specifically target a person or an individual, and they will craft a very, very deliberate message that is very contextual. For example, when I used to work at a bank, we saw attacks where attackers they would be talking to the accounts person, and they pretend to be the CEO and tell the accounts people, you need to pay this straight away, and it would actually be a fake invoice that would go to and it would be paid to the attacker's bank account, and that is not an unusual. Then there's malware. Now, malware encompasses a few different things. The one, obviously, we know viruses, Trojans are kind of old school now, and worms, but probably the most prevalent malware at the moment is ransomware. So if you're not familiar with ransomware, basically what it is when the piece of code, a program goes in, and it will go in and compromise your computer or your system, your enterprise environment, and it will encrypt all your data. And the only way to unencrypt it is to pay a ransom, and then the attackers will give you the key to unencrypt it. I will say that we definitely advise you don't pay ransoms, and also there's no guarantee they're going to give you the key back, give you the key to unlock and unencrypt the data. And the research shows that if you do pay a ransom, and bear in mind lots of companies do, that then will be targeted again because you're considered to be you're considered to be an easy target. Denial of service, that's when there's a couple of different ways of doing this, which I don't have time to go into, but basically denial of service is, there's a number of different ways. There's a number of different ways that you can overwhelm a system, either with some kind of traffic, or there's a few other ways of doing it that means the system is no longer able to respond. And of course, that means it could well mean you can't do business. SQL injection is a way, a SQL or SQL is a database. So if you manage to inject commands into the database that shouldn't have been there, you can manipulate data, extract data, you can delete the entire table. Cross-site scripting is a way, there's a couple of different methods of doing this, but essentially is a way of injecting code in through websites. Like I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into it. Please look them up if they sound interesting. Social engineering is tricking people into giving passwords or other details or logging in. You're probably familiar with that. I'm sure if any of you have if anyone who's listening has a corporate job, you've probably done some kind of training around phishing and social engineering. The other one there is zero-day exploits. Now, this one gets a lot of press. Now, zero-day is a vulnerability that doesn't have a patch. So obviously that's scarier because often we say you must patch. You've got a vulnerability that has no patch. It cannot be patched. Now, 0 days are not very common. They do certainly happen, but usually they only exist for a short period of time, because as soon as a 0 day becomes public, whichever manufacturer or company that is responsible for the product or the technology will usually issue a patch really quickly. Now, I saw someone put in the comments they wanted me to talk briefly about the solutions. Really briefly, for phishing, it's about user training and awareness, because it's a human problem. You need to teach people to not respond to phishing. Malware, there's a ton of different things. It really depends on the type of malware. In general, you should be having a good anti-malware program. Like I said, I'm just talking about it as a capability. I'm not going to recommend a program, but you need to be using some kind of commercial. Worth pointing out that if you're just using your computer at home, I know, well, Windows especially, I'll shout out to Windows already has a lot of this stuff inbuilt into it. You remember maybe 20 years ago, you had to buy a separate antivirus package. You don't now, but it does depend on the operating system you're using. For ransomware, basically you need to keep things patched. And it is to do with user training, not clicking on things. And just in case you do experience ransomware, you need to have backups so you can restore all your data without having to pay the ransom. Denial of service, you need a good network infrastructure, and we actually do have specific tools and programs and technologies that will kind of filter out denial of service. SQL injection is to do with how you write your database and it's how you write your website that sits in front of a database. Cross-site scripting is to do with how you write the website and secure coding. Social engineering is a training thing, training humans not to give information away. 0 days, it depends what it is. 0 days, you've got to hope that all your other security controls stand up until the 0 days patch. And I will come back to that because that leads nicely on to something else that I'm going to talk about. Very briefly, I'm not going to talk about this loads, but there is a standard that is used across the industry called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And you can see attack is actually spelled ATTACK, attack. And this is a list of all the different kinds of attacks that this is how they've been classified. And they're also classified by sort of how they work as well. So you have reconnaissance, then execution, initial access. Initial access is how you get your foot in the door of a system. execute, starting to run commands in the system. Persistence is how you stay there. And because sometimes attackers know they get rumbled, but they will try and find a way to stay in your environment, even if they think that you've not even if they think that you've got rid of them. So I'm not going to go into this. You can look this up online. It's all free, open source. But this is it was an attempt to make a way that we can talk about standard, like a standard way of talking about different types of attacks. So check it out online. So next one up. Like I said, this is a very whistle-stop tour, but hopefully some of this will spark your interest, and you can go read more yourself, is risk management. Now, this is a really fundamental part of cybersecurity. Some more technical security people will roll their eyes when they hear about, you can't really separate security and risk. They kind of go together. And so essentially there's like a circle of risk, because it goes round and round and round and round. And the reason I want to call this out is because a lot of security people use these terms incorrectly. And so, I mean, go through them for you. So if we go from sort of the top right. So an attack it exploits a vulnerability. So if you attack a system, it needs to find a weakness or a vulnerability in a system to be able to be successful. Now, vulnerabilities expose a business to risks. So if a business knows it has some vulnerabilities in its system, then it knows that it is at risk of being attacked. And then to reduce risk, we introduce countermeasures. Now, countermeasures can be a number of different things. I'll come on to this. They can be technical, they can be people, they can be process, and they protect the assets in your organization. And then assets can be compromised by threats so they can be threat actors. Like I said, they can be, criminals, they can be spies, and they use attacks. And this is how we go round and round and round and round circle of risk. So this is why it's really important to remember security is never a one-time thing. You can't like go through a system and say, oh, this is secure now, I never have to look at this again, because threats and attacks and vulnerabilities change all the time. We often find new vulnerabilities and new exploit vulnerabilities, or we find a new vulnerability that an old attack is able to exploit. So we're constantly, it's always really important to remember that our work is never done in security. We're constantly having to reassess this, and depending on how things change or the risk changes. So if the risk goes up, if a business considers something to be more risky, they might want to put more countermeasures in. And so that's why we're constantly doing this assessment piece. So I talked about the controls before. So controls fall into the 5 capital controls, which is probably what most people think of. There's physical controls. Now, nowadays, physical controls are often done by cloud providers, because physically a lot of technology sits in a data center and a cloud provider. But still think about your personal laptop or your phone or whatever it is. If you've got access to, say, your work emails or anything from work, and someone steals that, that's a physical control that's gone wrong. We also have admin controls, operational controls. So that's how we run systems and how we administer them. And then last but not least, there's legal and regulatory. So legal and regulatory will change depending on what industry you're in, what jurisdiction you work in. But they're also things that have to be considered. So usually one business will not have just one of these. There are multiple layers. I tried to ask Copilot to do this, to try and assess, draw something for me. It didn't do the best job, but let me, how we assess security risks is, the first thing is you need to identify all your assets. So if you don't know what you've got, you don't know how to protect. You can't protect, don't know it exists. So the first thing to do is to have like an inventory of all your technology that you want to protect. Ideally, just all of it, because you should be wanting to protect all of it. But, sometimes there are some weird situations. Then you want to assess the vulnerabilities against that asset. So say I've got a website. So if I've just got normal, e-commerce website, I have to be like, okay, what could potentially be a vulnerability? Is it that my e-commerce website isn't very well coded and it has vulnerabilities in the code? There are all kinds of things. Is it that we only have one person who actually runs the website? And then we do something called a likelihood assessment. So we basically and an impact assessment. This is like step 2 and 3. Basically, when we look at a risk, we consider two things, which is what is the likelihood that this risk would eventuate? How likely is it? And if it eventuated, what would the impact? So if something has a 1 in a billion chance of happening, but if it happened, it would be very, very serious, that isn't necessarily a really big risk. If it's only going to happen once every 200 years or whatever it is, that's not very likely. Whereas, say we have a medium issue, or what has been assessed to be, say, medium, but we think it might happen fairly regularly, that probably needs more controls putting against it, because there's actually going to be more tangible impact. But it's important to say that when we're doing this assessment, every like every single business will assess these things differently. I think that's a really, really important thing to say. You know, one business might find something acceptable or might think it's high impact, another business won't. So it's not a cookie, we need so many security people, because each organization and business needs to do this kind of assessment themselves. And then there's a prioritization that happens. So after we've done that risk calculation, it's, hey, do we want to fix this, or should we fix this? It's one of the things that people often have a misconception about security, is that we need to fix everything. The reality is we can't fix everything. That's actually not possible. So what we have to do, all organizations are limited by time and money and resources. And so generally a prioritization exercise has to take place. Like what issues are the, which risk is the most important to address, or which risks, what can we afford to do? It might not be a money thing, it might be a resource or something else. And that's what we do. And this is a continuous monitoring thing. So we do this again and again and again and again, because things are always changing. Businesses add new assets, new threats come out, etc. So we're constantly having to redo this risk piece. So that's how we look at how we deal with things in security, but definitely everything, because we just can't. So security practices and documentation. This is an interesting one. So again, it's I'm going to talk about some of these names because they're often used incorrectly, even by some. So what the difference between a policy, a standard, a baseline, a guideline, and a procedure, because they are all different. So policy is a high-level document that sort of overlines your security goals and principles. So you might also call it a strategy. A standard is something more detailed, where it provides guidelines and requirements about implementing security controls and measures. So they're more concrete. So, you could say something like, all laptops must be bolted to the desk. It might, that might be just, go with me. Whereas a baseline is for technical things. A baseline is where we talk about like the minimum configuration you need. So let's say we take, I don't know, my phone here. We'll say any iPhone that is going to be email needs to be fully up to date on the latest version of iOS. It needs to have some anti-malware installed on it. And this is like getting to our baseline. And say we took a server, you would say, this server has to have all the latest updates. It needs to have malware protection installed, have access to the internet directly, etc. And these baselines, there are some industry standard ones, but most organizations will take their industry standard one and they'll tweak it to their needs. Excuse me. And then a guideline is where it actually tells you, because you can't write a standard for everything, right? It's not possible. You can't write, if anyone's tried to write rules for everything, and this is not even IT, it's pretty impossible. So a guideline is supposed to be something that is referred to when you don't have a specific security standard. So it's trying. And then last but not least, sort of going down in specificity. Can I say that word? No. Is a security procedure. This will literally tell you line by line what to do. So this could be how you configure some kind of security control, but it could also be if there is an incident, you need to call the following people. You need to do this and this and this and this and this. So that's kind of what we do there. Oops, that is not what I meant to do. Excuse me. And then finally, we've got regulations. Now, as I said, I touched on regulations before. Unless you're specifically doing crime and forensics, actually, day to day, you probably won't deal with laws in the same way that I think some people think we do. But we certainly look at regulations. So some of the ones that we come across all the time is the GDPR, which is EU privacy. There's in the US, there's something called HIPAA, which is health insurance and how you protect health records. And so those also have to be taken into consideration, but what will apply will depend on what industry you're in, where the business is located, etc. But that's something we also have to take into consideration. So zero trust. Now, zero trust is a word that's been thrown around a lot. For a time, it definitely was a buzzword, a big old buzzword, and I didn't like it very much. I'm not going to lie, the biggest fan of zero trust because I thought it was too buzzwordy and didn't really mean anything. But I can tell you now that it actually does. And so let me tell you. This is a really nice. This is a really, really nice diagram here. So first of all, we have traditional security. So before we had the cloud and everything was just in people's data centers, it was really easy to draw like a nice line around. You can see that dotted line, like we could see our servers were there. We had they were all coming from like one place. So it was easy to draw that line around them. But nowadays we have cloud. And so in cloud, there is cloud, you could be using multiple clouds. There's multiple clouds out there, whether it's Microsoft or someone else. So you could have some technology in one cloud, some in another. You've got now we've got even more mobile devices. They might not be hooked back into your data center in the same way. And so the difference is with zero trust. Rather than in traditional security, where we said, where are you coming from? Are you coming from the data center? Are you coming from a location? You now have to be like, who are you? Because all of our assets and technology is so widespread now, it's not possible to use that where are you coming from as a good indicator of someone's trustworthiness. So instead now for every single little bit of technology, who are you? Who are you? Prove to me who you are and why you should have access to things. And so that's what we're talking about when we say zero trust. Now, for most businesses, unless they've been born, we say born in cloud. So unless they've been created or founded maybe in the last 5 years, a bit more, and that they built everything in cloud. Most businesses will probably have a mixture of these architectures. If they've been around a long time, they will have built their architecture like traditional security. And then as they've adopted new technologies, they've gone to more zero trust. But to move the traditional security into zero time and work. So it's often the case that you see businesses straddling two of these kind of ways of doing things. But the plan is to move to zero trust because it's much better. Now, there's another concept that's worth talking about here as well, which is something called defense in depth. I would come back to this. This is layering of controls. So This is it's also known as the Swiss cheese model. If anybody comes from a safety industry or a safety background, like say health or mining or something like that, they use the same concepts in those industries as well for safety. What we see is we have a threat, and then we have, well, it says losses in here, but we can say like a breach. And then we put layers of controls or defenses in place to prevent that from occurring. Now, when things occur, they only occur because all of the holes in the Swiss cheese model lined up. And the more layers of Swiss cheese we have, the less likely it is they line up, because we can't just trust on one security control to protect everything, because sometimes they fail. So that's why we want layers of different security controls. So you know how I talked about, we have technical controls, we have process controls, we have all those different types of controls. Ideally, to protect against the threat, we would have layers of defenses. And so the more defenses you have, the less likely it is that something will actually eventuate, because one of these controls will stop it. Now, of course, you can't take it too far, because we always say in security, assume breach, that we assume that at some point there's going to be a breach and something's going to go wrong. But the more defenses we can put in place, the less likelihood we can have of that happening. And yeah, I want to say here, listen to anybody who says that security is 100%. There is no such thing as 100% security. We cannot reduce our risk to zero. We can reduce our risk as far as possible using these layered defenses, but it is not possible to say something is 100% completely possible. And anyone who tells you differently is very wrong, and possibly a salesperson. So next up, let's look at the shared responsibility model. Now, this is actually not a security specific concept, but it goes wider than that. But in the context of understanding security, particularly in cloud, and let's face it, everybody's using cloud to some extent. So shared responsibility is something we talk about where your cloud provider, whoever they are, it doesn't have to be Microsoft, the controls that they put in place for security and the controls that you need to do. Now, those sets of controls will change who does what, essentially, depending on exactly what technology you're deploying. So if we have a look at this diagram that I've got up on the screen here, you can see if it's traditional technology, so it's all in your data center and nothing's on cloud, you're responsible for everything because you don't have a cloud provider involved. If you're using infrastructure as a service, so infrastructure as a service is just where you run what we often call like bare metal, so servers and networking and in a cloud provider. As you can see, the gray boxes are the cloud provider doing a bit of things, so they're going to take care of the physical side of things because you've put your stuff in their data center. So they take care of that. But the rest of it, things like, installing an operating system, updating it, building an application, that's all on you. Then for platform as a service, as you can see, as I'm sort of going to the left, there's more responsibilities for your cloud provider. The cloud provider offers a platform for platform as a service, and they're managing the underlying infrastructure, whereas you, the end user, is just going to do the application development and how the data is handled. And then last but not least, you've got SaaS or software as a service. So most of that, as you can see, the majority of the controls are done by your cloud provider, but you're still, on the hook to make accounts and how the data is handled, etc. The reason this is so important is because if there's a misunderstanding about who is doing what controls, particularly from security, you can end up with gaps. And if you have gaps in your security controls, of course, that means that if you think that your cloud provider is doing, updating your operating system, but actually you should be doing it because you're using infrastructure as a service, if nobody's updating the operating system, it can get behind on its updates. And then if some of the updates were fixing security issues, your machine might still be vulnerable. Thing to do, but every cloud provider out there should have, and I believe most do, some diagrams and documentation that explain who should be doing what. So if you're building something in cloud, you always need to be sure that you're very clear who's doing what for that reason. So, as I said, this is I wanted to go for about 45 minutes. I haven't done too badly. But I wanted to know, I've sort of kept an eye on the questions. But if anyone wants to add any more questions, and I'll just answer them. If I can, and I will go and have a look at my screen. I'm going to have a look at my phone. It might be easier to see if there are any comments. But if you've got any about what I've just talked about, or if there's anything else that's sprung to mind that's security related, I'll try and answer it for you. Just pop it in the chat. Seems like we might be quite quiet. Oh, I was expecting some more questions. Maybe, maybe. Is Microsoft hiring? We are. Well, we're a very large company. I'm going to assume that this. Assuming that you're asking specifically about security, we do have security roles. The best thing you can do is go to our careers website and search for security. I'm not sure where you are. We do hire in different parts of the world for different roles. So I think the best thing you can do there is just go and look at the careers website, see what's out there, and see if there's anything that takes your fancy that's in your part of the world, etc. So the next one, do you see a gap in security when it comes to implementing Copilot solutions, considering it becomes a bit of a black box for data? It is not a black box for data. That's very funny you ask about that, because it's very topical, of course. But I was, been talking about this a lot recently. So Copilot isn't a black box, actually. With our AI, there are documents online that you can read, but essentially Copilot does not ingest your customer data. What happens with the model is the model is trained by us on our data, not customer stuff, and then we sort of lock it away. And when you implement a Copilot, you basically get your tenant, and the Copilot will reach up when you ask it something. It takes that, it uses the LLM to start formulating the response, and then it will reach into your data. If you've asked about data or it needs to ask about data, it has a look at what's in your tenant, and also you can label things and exclude them and include them depending on what you need to do, and then it will give you an answer. So it uses it as an augmentation rather than actually ingesting it. But it is worth saying there as well, and we do have a lot of documentation on this online, that essentially putting AI on top of any technology or any enterprise environment, whether it's Copilot or any other kind of AI largely what it does is it's like kind of supercharged search engine, right? So if your data is in a mess and not well protected, not well labeled, then and you put Copilot over the top of it, Copilot's just really good at finding things, but it's essentially inheriting your existing security posture. So it's not that Copilot makes things worse, it's that Copilot can highlighting vulnerabilities that folks already had in their estate, particularly in regards to data. I could go on about that one for a long time, but there is quite a bit of material online about Copilot security, so go check that out. There's a question, will there be a follow-up with this with actual instructions about how to implement security? That is a very, no, not in this series, because this is basic security concepts. And that's, and how to implement security hopefully one of the takeaways from that bit of a fire hose of information I gave you was that it's not a one size fits all. So what you choose to do in one organization is not what you choose to do in another. We have some general best practices that we'd recommend people look at, but often they get so it's worth it's worth it's not I can't just it's very I think most security people would be out of a job if it was as straightforward as saying, hey, this is just how you implement things step by step. Having said that, if you're interested in I have a series that we've just started releasing on the Microsoft Security YouTube channel called Secure Future Initiative Tech Tips, which is where we take some of the learnings from our Secure Future initiative and we do go in depth with about 9 or 10 different things to implement them. But again, I don't think I would have enough time in the world to be able to provide you with a series where we talk definitively about how to do things, because it is changeable. Now my phone just died, so I can't check the questions on my phone. So I'm gonna just get my screen switched over so I can keep reading them. So give me a second. And let's see where I got to. Calculated risk in a network. So again, that's I guess it depends what kind of risk in a network. It's a bit of a vague question. I mean, in general, obviously we want to prevent unauthorized access to a network. We want to make sure that things are not data traveling across a network is not intercepted. But network security controls are not as important as they used to be because of that zero trust thing, because we don't have everything in the same place. On things being intercepted and stuff, but there's a lot of other things we sort of consider. But as I said, it's very dependent on what's there, what you've got in your network, how it's set up, how it's architected, and then we would go through that risk process that I described earlier, specific things to work out what the risks actually were. And this is why it's not one size fits all. How does Microsoft protect their clients in the cloud? Again, that is a huge question. It's a huge question. But what I'll say is we do to protect people. As I was saying with that shared responsibility, it's always important that you understand what we're supposed to be doing and what you're supposed to be doing. And it does change depending on it changes depending on exactly what you're building, but we do get a lot of independent assessments done by third parties. So if you're where we say trust but verify, you have to trust that we're doing the right thing, but you need to verify that it works for you, because we can't take you around our data center. We can't sort of click around and show you how our platform works, but we do get these independent read. They're all online to see that we're doing what we say we're doing. That's probably the short version of that. What certification would most likely align with this? It would be the SC 900, which is the foundations. I would say you would probably want to do, because this is very, very non-product specific. Oh yes, and thank you, Owlbear. Thank you for saying SC 900. SC 900 is our security fundamentals. It is a little bit more product specific, so I definitely go read some of the learn material online, because I'm not really going to be talking about too much about specific products because we're doing our real security foundations. But I think you could make a decent pass at it with some of the content in here as well. But we've got lots of stuff online. Let's see. What tools would you recommend for OWASP? Ivan, I'm going to ask you to re-ask that question, because I don't know what you mean. Do you mean what tools would you recommend for testing against OWASP? Could you sort of rephrase that? because I don't have the question. I think that's what you mean, but if you wouldn't mind, if you're still there, putting it in the chat. Oh, that is what you meant. Oh, thank you for replying so quickly. Depends what you're testing. So a good place to start would be Burp Suite. That's a nice starter one. There's Kali Linux as well. It depends which bits of OWASP you are testing for. But I'd start with Burp Suite and Kali Linux and have a look at those toolings, particularly Burp Suite. That's probably more a web thing. Data Nerd says, what's the best certification for security? There isn't just one. It really depends. Security is huge. There are lots of different certificates out there. I would say my general advice to people starting is do the certificates that are cheap or where you can get a lot of free material or you don't have to pay very much to take these. There are some certificates where it might cost you thousands of dollars to take the exam, and I would really just recommend waiting until you have a workplace that will pay for that for you. But there are a lot of security certificates out there. But starting with things like the SC 100 and other foundational things is a good place to start. They're expensive. Oh, can you explain what Microsoft Sentinel does? I'm going to do that in a later. We'll talk about that in a later, just because I'm conscious of time. It is a SIEM, so it correlates logs and then raises incidents for security operations. But I'm going to talk about that in a later episode. Stop that one until we get there. Ventel says, can or will organizations who utilize Copilot be able to leverage its capabilities as an asset management tool? Maybe. I mean, it's not. I mean, we have lots of Copilot outside the security space. I mean, aside from the fact we like to have nice asset inventories, maybe you could use it for that. I mean, to my knowledge, we don't have a Copilot that is for that. So maybe, but I think you would struggle, I think, to use it for that. That you could try and see if it can do it. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think maybe is the answer I would give, but it's certainly not intended for that. So I'm not sure how well it could work, that you could give it a try. Oh, I'm just checking. I haven't. Oh, can I give some info about EDR and XDR? I'm actually going to talk about that in a later episode, but EDR and XDR is you know what? It's like midnight here, and I actually cannot remember what. I will tell you what it is. Someone can go look it up. It's essentially it's used as a bit of a buzzword, to be honest with you, because an EDR and an XDR isn't really one product. It's usually a mixture of endpoint detection response. Actually, it stands for endpoint detection and response, which is endpoint stuff. So it's like old school antivirus. It's like the modern version of, and so we're protecting endpoints. And if there's malware installed, or if you click on something, you get malware, an EDR is supposed to pick that up and neutralize it. XDR is like extended, and it's more conceptual than a product, though some people will say it's a product. It's where we take endpoint detection response and we extend it into everything else as well. So we're protecting endpoints and servers, and it's also going to do our monitoring and our incident response. Using XDR is basically putting a bundle of capabilities together, and I will talk about that a little bit more when we get to that later on in the series, because we do have an episode on that a little bit later when we get there. Capabilities. Cool. I think I've managed to go through all the questions. Hopefully I don't think I've missed anyone. Yeah, I'll leave it. I'll just ramble for see if anyone else has any questions they want to put in the chat. But just whilst we do that, I'll tell you, you can have a look at that aka.ms link, and it'll give you an idea of what we're going to cover off. We're going to look at all the different areas of security, or at least the capabilities that we implement, like identity, EDR. We'll look at security operations, we'll look at some AI security. So we're going to go through some of these things and what they are and how we implement them, etc. In the upcoming sessions. So yeah, doesn't look like we've got any more questions for now. I realized there were some big questions on there that I've gone through quite quickly because we don't have all the time in the world, unfortunately. But hopefully that you found this interesting. I know there's a lot of information. I hope that you can join me again for the following weeks. If you can't, as it is going to be recorded and put on YouTube, so you can watch it later. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day wherever you are in the world. And yeah, I will see you on the next one. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thank you again, Sarah. Our session is a part of a series. To register for future shows and watch our episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. And we will see you at the next one.